The Dragon Prince has lost a significant degree of its popularity since its apex in season 3. I do not consider this a particularly fair outcome. I think the show is still quite good. I think whatever the missteps of season 4, they are relatively minor, and season 5 was a significant step up. Still, it does not look like the fans are returning, even though the show still has 2 more seasons. Perhaps, I have wondered, something great and magnificent might come to reignite interest in the show. But just that line of thinking reveals, I believe, the essence of the problem. The show has lost a significant degree of popularity, in part because of what it did, but also in part because of what it didn't do. After the long hiatus that admittedly was not entirely the show's fault, it was in part Netflix's fault and in part the fault of the craziness of the COVID times. But because of that hiatus, the show needed to do something grand and spectacular and magnificent to draw back the fans it had lost, and it did not do this. Fan attention is fickle, especially for a show that is telling a linear story in which fans are invested. It is not something like, say, The Simpsons, where the people who regularly watch that show just keep watching it season after season after season, long after it stopped being good. When a show has a distinctive beginning and middle, the pressure is necessarily on for it to have a satisfying end. Emerson talks about the constant fluctuation of life in all its forms, how nothing is constant except in death. As long as all living things are alive, they're constantly in the process of change and flux, from flowers to animals to human beings. What seems so clear and concise one day can seem fogged and meaningless the next. This is scary for Emerson, but it is also an opportunity. It is the potential of having a boundless future before one, to not be bound by the hierarchies and the expectations of the past. Everyone is united in being in this sense of constant change. Everyone's own passions are connected to the world, are connected to this great sea of change that is always occurring and always in motion. Emerson prizes people for being endless seekers with no past at their back. That does not mean the past is irrelevant, but that it should not define and shape the goals and expectations of the present. That passions and desires arise organically from the now, from specific circumstances that are constantly coming into being, and not vague shadows of what happened in the distant past. It's a very quintessentially American view, but it's also a quintessentially democratic view. It's a view that says that it's not that people's opinions in the now are always perfect, but the fact that these opinions are always in motion, that are always subject to change, does provide hope that it can be moving toward something new, that it does not have to be contained within the limitations and the prejudices of the past. That basically translated into the media climate means that if a show stops providing an audience with what it desires, people tend to complain or they tend to stop watching, especially if they are people with high expectations for a show. Now, this can be quite narrow and quite limiting, especially when the fan response is based on a shallow conception of a show. And I do believe that this happens more frequently than a lot of people in the internet fandoms would like to admit. For instance, I think there are perfectly reasonable criticisms of Korra, but a lot of people just don't like the show because they're not willing to engage with it on its terms, on actually understanding what it is trying to do thematically and philosophically, and just criticize it for not being Avatar, which it doesn't try to be. Nonetheless, this constant yearning in fans can be a good thing because it allows pre-existing expectations to be questioned. If a show is not giving people what they want, then regardless of whether what people want is always perfect, it's at least a sense of life and vitality that people will question and even abandon a certain show. And I think that's what is happening with the Dragon Prince. People are not getting what they want from the show. It's doing some things wrong, and it's not doing some other things. It is at best kind of static and stale for a lot of people. Even someone like me who is still quite enjoying the show, I don't really see where it is going, aside from vague terms and aside from characters like Claudia, in whom I'm extremely interested. I want to see what happens to her corruption journey, to her descent into bitterness and solipsistic resentment that leads to her so reductively following Erebos's control. What happens to her after that? That's interesting. But the show does not as often provide these questions. It does not as often give people reasons to keep watching unless they are already obsessed with the show. And that obsession wanes. If the show isn't constantly delighting people, their patience tends to thin. There are things that people criticize about the show that I think are valid, that I think the show is in fact doing a bit wrong. For instance, the time skip from Season 3 to Season 4, while interesting in concept, felt a bit diffuse in execution. A time skip should be a statement of purpose. It should have meaning and resonance. It should convey something in the mood or atmosphere of a particular show. Not to keep bringing everything back to Korra, but the time gap between Season 3 and Season 4 of Korra is quite meaningful. It amplifies the sense of disorientation and alienation that Korra experiences, the sense of being adrift from a world that has moved on without her, and calls further attention to her attempt to try to find some sense of harmony for herself and herself in the world, try to redefine how she really conceives of herself in this constantly transforming world. The time skip in The Dragon Prince doesn't really seem to have any resonance like that. It seems a bit random. The breaking up of Callum and Rayla caught a lot of people by surprise, and it engendered a lot of ill will, because a lot of people block season 3, and at the end of season 3, they're together, it's triumphant. This is a major thrust of the show, a major part of its engine, of its momentum. And then suddenly season 4 comes and they're not together anymore. And the explanation provided as to why is rather diffuse. Now, obviously, if you've read Through the Moon, which I still really like, you know the entire story, but most people have not. And it's not good to expect most people to read a graphic novel just so they can understand what happens in the show. There are other plot points that fall a bit flat and a bit tepid for me. I wish they were doing more with Ezran. There is a really interesting story here about his kingship and the maturation process that requires, but the show does not necessarily have a clear grasp on what its ideal of a great king is, what a great leader is, and so the process with Ezran feels a bit diffuse. A lot of the characters just seem pulled along by the plot. It's not that there is any reason why they shouldn't be going after Erebos, but it feels motivated simply by, oh, you have to do what's right. It doesn't feel as motivated by character-related reasons. These are all unfortunate things, but by themselves they would not lead to such an evaporation of interest in the show. I think a lot more has to do with what the show hasn't done. It hasn't really appealed to people in a way that I think a show kind of needs to after such a large time gap, both in the show itself and in the space from season 3 to season 4. If a major twist had happened, if, I don't know, Rayla had died, there would have been an excitement in the show, especially if it had been well done. There would have been a resurgence of interest. But there's been nothing like that. The show can either succeed by just being a really, really good light adventure narrative focused on the rapport of people traveling around the world and really enjoying themselves, like a lot of Avatar, especially in season 1 and to a certain extent season 2. That's a perfectly fine way of storytelling, but the Dragon Prince doesn't really have that level of rapport between its group, and the show is too focused on a lot of these bigger plot elements at the expense of character journeys, which would be fine if the plot, the greater thematic narratives, were getting more dour, more conflicted and interesting. But that's not really happening to the extent that one might want them to the extent that really grips people. And so the show just feels a bit diffuse. It doesn't always know what it wants to be, with the exception of the Viren Claudia narrative, which is very well done and absolutely devastating and haunting. It's the best narrative in the show because it has a clear sense of itself. But the rest of the show doesn't to the same extent. It doesn't have a clear sense of Erebos besides being this mysterious, ancient, evil villain. It doesn't have a clear sense of the temptations and conflicts that Callum personally is facing, or that Callum and Rayla are facing. A lot of characters just don't really seem to have a lot of the same character-based questions lingering as they did in the first few seasons of the show, and I do think that has something to do with the decay of interest. The show is still, I think, pretty good. Its character relationships are strong enough, but it's mostly decent as a continuation of what's already been done. There isn't a lot that's enough to grip someone, to pull them back in if they have been drifting away, whether because they actively dislike decisions the show has made, or perhaps more commonly because it's been a long time since the first few seasons of the show, and they've kind of grown disinterested. Hopefully the show manages to pull people back into its orbit. I don't know if this will happen, but Season 6 will be interesting. So anyway, tune in soon for next analysis. It will be coming soon, I promise you that. Thank you all again. Keep walking the Dragon Prince. It's a great show. Adios, comrades.